Let me tell you a tale about historical truth, about falsification and verification, about whether historians know what really happened in the past. For it isn't obvious at all that what has happened long ago can easily be accessed from the present. So we don't really have a grasp of the past. But still, historians tell you what really happened, and most of you believe it, blindly. I'd like to start by telling you a simple tale, which I strangely enough came to like while reading Jonathan Haidt's book The Righteous Mind. Let us think of an entirely fictitious study, which would state that women who like to drink coffee have a higher chance of getting breast cancer. If all people on Earth would have to find a flaw in said study's methodology, who do you think would be most likely to find any? Of course it's women who really love coffee, because they actually have a horse in that race. They want to prove that it is wrong, because they're interested in continuing to drink coffee without having to think of breast cancer. This is a subset of the confirmation bias, a term which means that we always look for the information we actually want to find, not the information which is objectively there. So we're not the perfect objectivists we'd like to be. We are subjective and biased, and we also have our political leanings. Each of us sees the world through a different lens. For example, most people will agree that if asked about the topic of the history of nation-states, the tendency that the far left will come to drastically different results than the far right is very high. This discussion is currently at a severe point of disagreement, especially in Europe. Nationalists may say something like, "We need to go back to nation-states with less migration, because our ancestors have lived here, therefore this land belongs to us." While globalists want to increase migration by claiming that all of us once were migrants. It seems we tend to read history differently according to our general political beliefs. Political partisanship was also a major point of discussion among historians, furiously discussed most prominently in the aftermath of the Second World War. Some of the historians were closely connected to Nazism, and nobody knew how to deal with that situation. It was obvious that many German historians in the Third Reich had not conformed to rational scientific standards, but had rather pushed the political agenda of the Nazis with their supposedly scientific work. For example, Helmut Berwe postulated that the Nazis were actually genetically linked to the ancient Greeks. Today it is obvious that this is not the case. Yet he could publish this without a problem during the reign of the National Socialists. He even continued to work as a historian later on. But the victorious powers of World War II also wrote history so it fit their needs. They too were biased. Considering this, it should be clear that history needed some theoretical grounding, some method of addressing this political partisanship of historians. So we just found a major problem. History seems to be somewhat ideological, therefore somewhat subjective. Prior to the 1960s, it was often believed that the goal of historiography was to get ever closer to an absolute truth. Historians try to verify what really happened, an optimism best expressed by two very famous quotes of Leopold von Ranke, who said that historians should show how it really was, and that they should wish to dissolve themselves, so that only things themselves could talk. What became ever clearer was that nobody can be objective, that everybody is biased, that nobody can show how it really was, that everybody ultimately is somewhat subjective, especially in the light of the drastic differences between Nazi, Communist and Bourgeoisie historians. The assertion of objectivity was shattered into pieces. The historical faculties started to acknowledge and debate this problem, especially from the 70s onwards. The discussion revolved around the question of partisanship and bias on one hand, and the potential objectivity on the other. Some insisted that history can be objectively reported, others stated that one should not even try that. While historians with a somewhat Marxist leaning had no problem with partisanship, the non-Marxists usually said that historians needed to be objective. In the 1980s, as political tension between the United States and the Soviet Union slightly decreased, especially with political figures such as Mikhail Gorbachev, and the ideas of perestroika and glasnost, the main protagonists of the discussion changed, but the duality between subjectivity and objectivity remained the same. Postmodernists and radical constructivists like Ernst von Glasersfeld came about and claimed that history is basically just another narrative, that it is somewhat fictional, they usually said to each his own history. And as postmodernists are good in putting problems on the table, but rarely propose any solutions, it was somebody else who came up with an answer. Reinhardt Kosselleck, who postulated a veto power of the sources. This theoretical concept serves as a mediator between the two drastically diverging positions. He postulated an entanglement of bias and objectivity, yet also agreed with postmodernists to a certain degree that history is a narrative. But it is certainly not fictional at its core. If that would be the case, Game of Thrones would just be as validly historical as anything else. Since history is not purely objective, and we cannot get rid of our biased nature and political leanings, it is pretty hard to show how it really was in an objective manner. But bias can be limited by respecting the source material. For example, inside the theoretical framework of the veto power of the sources, it is not valid to say that Julius Caesar was killed because he was a Marxist, because none of the sources actually support that claim. If anything, they would disprove it. So the sources have a veto power. They limit the amount of possible biased interpretations to the extent that everything which is not verifiable or falsifiable by looking at the source material is essentially an unsubstantiated claim. It does therefore not conform to the scientific method, meaning it is negligible and insignificant for scientific discourse. As a consequence, this means that the source material can help identify what surely did not happen. Or, to quote Kosselleck, sources only protect us from errors. They do not tell us what we should say. So in contrast to Ranke's show how it really was, we should rather show how it certainly was not. Well, in contrast to the radical postmodernists, the veto power of the sources asserts an objective past. The problem with the postmodern view on history, i.e. history as a somewhat fictional narrative, is that one could easily interpret it as denying certain historical events, which most postmodernists never intended at all. They simply wanted to point out that history cannot be unbiased and has a narrative element to it. Kosselleck put all this together and assumed that historical figures like Churchill actually lived and historical events like the Holocaust actually did happen, insofar as we have sources which support this claim. At the same time, the veto power of the sources accepts that history is not true in an absolute manner and might have to be modified and changed if new approaches to the source material are figured out, or new sources are found altogether. So where then is objectivity in historical research to be found? The historian and theorist Stefan Jordan summarizes this quite nicely. Quote, "Statements about the past can be objective or true as long as they are free of inherent contradictions, are not contrary to the laws of nature, and are based on actual remains from the time period referred to. But given the varying biased subjective opinions of historians, the veto power of the sources only works in a modern, rational environment of scientific discourse. This means that there needs to be debate. This is to say, a truth can only be generated if different opinions are allowed to clash. This means Kosselleck's veto power asserts an inherent or possible bias and partisanship in all participants. Just imagine, who is best to criticize a Marxist? Most likely a non-Marxist. So, if the Marxist idea stands up to the non-Marxist's critique, the idea is probably quite alright. This means that freedom of speech and expression are of the utmost importance for this concept to work. To find truth, anything needs to be furiously debated until a common opinion, in technical jargon, a communis opinio, arises among the majority of historians. In a perfect world, all the bad ideas had been falsified, and only the good arguments are left. And they are in line with the source material, and they are falsifiable. This is the reason why you should never trust a single historian. Only in debate and discourse lies objectivity, not in a single opinion. The thing about science is that a single individual can be a scientist, but an idea has to be double-checked and hit with the sledgehammer to figure out whether it's a good one or not. Ideally by somebody of a different opinion. Consequently, a single idea is not scientific if it does not hold up to discourse. Only when different opinions are allowed to clash with each other Is objectivity possible? Jonathan Haidt calls this institutionalized disconfirmation. It is probably the best single two-word phrase to understand the process behind the historical truth. So, although objectivity is to be found in historical research, truth ultimately is agreed upon.